This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, welcome everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, welcome to this session, which is a kind of informal book launch event for Tina Rock's book, Dynamic Realism. And this evening we have her in a relatively informal conversation with Lee Braver. So I will be doing the hosting of the event and sharing questions a little bit later. Let me just first of all introduce both of the speakers and then we'll get underway. But first of all, I'll get you both on screen. So, okay. Okay, so there you both are. Okay, so welcome to Lee Braver. He's Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Florida. His main interests are in continental philosophy, especially Heidegger and Foucault, Wittgenstein, realism, and dialogue between continental and analytic philosophy. He's the author of A Thing of This World, A History of Continental Anti-Realism, Heidegger's Later Writings, A Reader's Guide, Groundless Grounds, A Study of Wittgenstein and Heidegger, Heidegger Thinking of Being, and he's editor of Division 3 of Being and Time, Heidegger's Unanswered Question of Being. Tina Rock is a lecturer in philosophy at the School of Humanities, University of Dundee. In her work, she defends dynamic approaches to metaphysics, as well as process ontology by engaging with philosophy of biology, process philosophy, and phenomenology. Her main interests are continental philosophy, Heidegger, Husserl, Whitehead, philosophy of time, philosophy of biology, and integrating analytic and continental approaches. She's the author of An Ontology of the Concrete and the book we're launching today, Dynamic Realism, from Edinburgh University Press, just recently published. And I'd say that writing and publishing a book of philosophy is a great achievement in any context. And particularly given the trying times we're all going through at the moment, it's particularly an achievement. So I'd like to congratulate Tina, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this event today. So I'm going to hand over now to Tina and to Lee. They're going to have a conversation around issues raised in the book for about 45 minutes or so. And then we'll move over to some conversation, basically. And we're going to try to run that fairly informally. If you do have some questions, you can either post those in the chat, so write them up in the chat and I'll read them out. And you can write those anytime you like during the conversation, or if you like, you can just come on the mic and ask questions a bit later as well. So over now to Tina and Lee.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm going to be conducting the interview, I suppose. And I completely agree with you that we really should celebrate these achievements, these accomplishments. In any case, to write and publish a book in philosophy is an achievement. But of course, this is not just any book. It's an excellent book. It's a very ambitious book that covers a great deal of ground and really tries to do something innovative. So we are going to be delving into this today, and I appreciate the opportunity to be conversant with it. So, Professor Rock, the book is largely about, one of the main factors of it is process metaphysics, dynamic reality. So let's talk about the process of the book, the composition of it. How did you come up with the idea? What was the motivation for it? What was it that was lacking in the intellectual landscape that you felt needed filling?
Yeah, so I wanted to thank everybody to be here with me to celebrate this moment. And I agree. I think in academia nowadays, we also used to having to keep on and to working more and to producing more, that we don't stop and just enjoy when we have had an achievement. So I'm very glad that you're enjoying this achievement with me. And just for everyone's information, as those who know me know that when I get started, I don't stop. So I've asked Lee to kind of like rein me in. So if he interrupts, he's got like full veto powers. And I've asked him especially to stop me when I use too much jargon or when I start to drift off in too detailed a discussion. And I would invite anyone in the room to do the same. So if anything's unclear or if I use terminology that doesn't make sense, let me know. Because this is, as we said, this is supposed to be a conversation about topics that I'm really interested in. And I just want to share that interest with you. In that spirit, I'm just going to try to give like a general overview of what I'm doing and why I'm interested in it. There's many strands that have led to this book. Like there's many different influences that accumulated in this. And the first one for me was, I believe we all have like a philosophical question when we start studying. There's this one problem that bugs us if we're really into philosophy, and you always keep sticking with that problem. And my problem was, why does a leaf belong to the tree at one moment and doesn't belong to the tree in the other moment? So if a leaf is part of the tree in the summer and it sustains the tree, because without the leaf, without the chlorophyll, without the transformation of sunlight and nutrients into nourishment, the tree would die. And in the fall, the leaf suddenly becomes dirt, isn't part of the tree anymore. How does this work, right? And it's, for me, a very ontological question. It's a question about how do we create wholes? How do we distinguish wholes from each other? And what creates unities, right? And I was thinking about this and I didn't know how to answer this question. And then I went into my teacher's classroom that was at the theological faculty. And this was a metaphysician, and he told me, I'm now going to present how to not do metaphysics or ontology. Like, this is the wrong way to do it. And he proceeded to present Whitehead. Alfred North Whitehead is a process ontologist, and he was presenting this philosophy as an example of how not to do philosophy. And I was like, yes, this is it. That's exactly how reality is. This is my guy. So that's how I came to process philosophy.
So you wrote the book out of spite.
Basically. No, it just rang so true to me. It rang so true to me that if we actually look at reality, if we actually look at what's going on, there's always change happening. There is continuity, but there's always change. And we just prefer one state over the other. We prefer the state of the leaf with the tree over the state of the leaf at the floor, right? So it's our judgments that tells us what is an object that we want to hold on to and what's merely change or what's accidental things that we can disregard, right? So, and as that already kind of tells you, is the more you engage with process ontology and the more you use it, you have the experience that actually it seems to describe the world as we perceive it. It might not be.
So process ontology, do you want to put any more content into it beyond just the fundamental feature of reality is that it changes, or should we just leave it there?
So the reason why Whitehead was considered to be such a bad philosopher is because he introduces a lot of terminology. He makes very complex distinctions. It's a very big conceptual structure that is difficult to enter into. So if I wanted to introduce it in a solid manner, that would take a lot of time. But I think it might be worth to just go. The fundamental features of process ontology are that everything that we encounter is in a state of flux, right? Everything that we encounter is the continuation of a past and is directed towards a future. Whereas sometimes we behave as if things were stable, static entities that are kind of outside of time, that maintain their integrity. In reality, they're always ongoing. If we look closely enough and over a long enough time, if it's over a sufficient period of time and with enough depth or with enough detail, then reality unconceals itself as changing. This is a very phenomenological approach, and this is where phenomenology comes in, but I'll address that later. The second aspect that's really important with process ontology is the question, well, if everything is processes and everything is change, how does the whole stick together? How is it that all processes don't fall apart? And well, if you look at nature, if you look at your own body is kept in existence continuously by your heart pumping blood, by your cells regenerating, by your mitochondria transforming particles into other particles, by your genes being copied, and so on and so forth. So all these processes go on, and only when all these processes go on in a sort of harmonious, more or less stable manner, so it's not always identical the same, but it has to be within certain thresholds, then your body functions. And if one process runs amok, the whole system starts to disintegrate. So disintegration doesn't happen through change. Disintegration happens when the harmony between the changes, or when the interaction between the changes doesn't quite work anymore. Yeah. So, and that's the second feature of process ontology, that processes are related in a certain manner that we can call harmonious or creative or enjoyable. Whitehead would talk about enjoyable processes. Does more, or does that, do you think that, if anyone has questions, just let me know. Yeah. So the question now is, when you start doing this sort of process ontology, the first thing that I always encountered is the question that, but we see stable objects. We engage with stable objects. Look at your screen, it's stable. Look at the table, it's stable. The process philosophical answer would be yes, but you're not looking closely enough. Like, you're not looking on the microscopic level, and you're not looking for long enough. Look at it for 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 100,000 years, and it will disintegrate. It will evolve. It will change. Do we have a visitor?
Yeah.
So right, if you don't look close enough, and if you don't look over long enough, it appears as unchanging. And that's where phenomenology comes in, because phenomenology gives us a tool of clarifying experience and the way we look at experience and the way we use experience. If you read Whitehead, if you read any other process ontologist, they all emphasize very strongly that we have to focus on what we experience as we experience it, in order to be able to see the processual nature of reality. And phenomenology, in a way, does the same. Phenomenology tells us to clarify our experience, to not go with what we thought we experienced, but by actually looking at the experience closely enough and long enough, right? So the methodological approach kind of reflects, and the topics that arise, temporality, relationality, contingency, creativity, are the same as well. So a lot of the topics that come up and the ways of engaging with these topics aren't identical, they aren't the same, but they mirror each other. And the first path into this book for me was reading purely by chance, reading Whitehead and Husserl at the same time in parallel, and seeing how much overlap there was, right? And I have to admit, Husserl wasn't my way into phenomenology. My way into phenomenology was Heidegger. Again, another systematic thinker who uses language that feels very unapproachable. I like those guys. But in reading Whitehead and Husserl in parallel, there were just so many instances where they seemed to talk to each other, or talk about the same thing, and advising us to do the same things, but with certain subtle differences. But there seemed to be so much overlap that it was really surprising to me that nobody had actually done that before, brought phenomenology and process ontology together explicitly. There is some attempts, there is some engagement in paper length, but rarely in book length, and not a direct comparison. And what I did is I used the concept of time, temporality, as the anchor point that brings both together. So it's a comparison of Husserl's phenomenology and Bergson's and Whitehead's process ontology through the lens of temporality. Yeah. Why I wrote this book the way I did has another reason. One, these are very big traditions, and they have lots of exegesis, and they have lots of background. And usually when you talk to Husserlians or phenomenologists, they don't really know about Whitehead. And if you talk to process ontologists, they don't usually engage very much with Husserl. So there's always this problem of communication. Like, it's very difficult to find people who have an interest in both. So one aim of the book was to kind of introduce the one side to the other. So introduce phenomenology to the process thinkers and process thought to the phenomenologists, hoping that the overlap in interests and concepts is large enough to make that relatively easy, more easy than any other introduction. And the final reason for this book as it is rooted in Heidegger and Heidegger's philosophy of the event. And I apologize to those of you who are not familiar. This is going to be a bit technical. So in Heidegger's philosophy of the event, Heidegger develops this idea that we have different ways of understanding being that are all equally valid. They don't give you the same advantages and the same disadvantages. They don't give you the same descriptions of reality, but they have equal validity. They equally do things well and do things badly. And I was wondering, how is that possible? How can it be that we have completely different ways of understanding being that work, right? So my question was, a transcendental question, what does reality need to look like for that to be possible? And one way to answer that is to say, well, reality is internally multiple, creative, changing, evolving, and relational. So that allows us to collect or conceptualize, bring together different processes according to different understandings of being. So in a way, this book is an answer to the question, what does a world look like in which Heidegger's philosophy of the event is true, let's say. And finally, I have always had realist tendencies, but a very big allergic reaction to certainty, absolute statements, and static systems and substances. So what I'm trying to do here is to develop an understanding of a realism that remains creative, that remains open, that's not determined, that remains immanent, and that kind of falls between the chairs of pure materialism and traditional idealism. Because the traditional ways of talking about realism is either matter is real or absolute spirit or concepts are real, right? The ideas are real. And I'm trying to find a middle way between those two. Yeah, so I think that's a summary.
So it's rather serendipitous you talk about the chance co-reading of these two works, because I was just talking to my class the other day how I've been more and more interested in that idea of just bringing things together and seeing the connections just out of without a plan. And I had the idea, which I'm way too cowardly to ever do, of just picking the text for a class at random and just seeing what happens. I'm sure I'll never do it, but I like toying with the idea. And I've come to the conclusion that's how Derrida does a lot of his connections. Whatever he happens to read, he's able to because of what he calls intertextuality. But you talk about the temporality of being, and one particular aspect of temporality that informs the book is something like simultaneity. Because one of your main points in the book, and one of your kind of methodological points, the informing your approach, is that we cannot do ontology and then move on to epistemology, nor can we do epistemology and then use that to move on to ontology. Instead, they have to be done in tandem. They have to be done simultaneously in some sense. And it's a very striking claim. You're right to foreground it, because reason has always been seen, like time, to be linear, to be sequential. We move premise, 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 conclusion. And of course, that's also how we have foundationalism, which has been a basic notion of epistemology for quite some time. And the approach you're proposing can be seen as quite radical. Circular reasoning is considered a fallacy, and in some ways you're arguing, no, this is the appropriate way to reason. So my question is, can you tell us about the methodological approach, why you think it's important, and can you defend yourself against the stuffy traditionalists who say you've abandoned reason, argument, this doesn't work? how dare you, etc.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to do it in a linear fashion. So the idea is that I think, I don't think reason is one size fits all. I think there's ways of constructing reason or rational approaches that are very adequate and well situated to solve logical problems, abstract problems, theoretical problems. And that's the kind of reason we focused on for 2000 years. Now we're seeing the development of new types of logic. We're seeing dialectism, we're seeing engagement with the Indian Kantoshkoti, which is a similarly structured reason, but that allows for contradiction, or that allows for a third option, right? So we're seeing a loosening of the strictures of reason already. My claim now is, if your object of investigation is singular, radically singular, as reality is, like it's not something that can be abstracted from, generalized or repeated, if it is highly complex, and if it is context sensitive such that every change in any aspect affects the whole, right? You have a system, or you have an object of investigation that can be investigated with linear reason, but doing so leads to all sorts of one-sidednesses, all sorts of biases. And I think that's the learning of the radical critique, both in continental and analytic philosophy, that just reason alone, if it's applied to the whole, in its complexity and concreteness, doesn't work. So I have two options now. Either I can try to develop a different language to approach the complexity and the wholeness, or I can try to break it apart to analyze the elements. And again, I'm trying, what I would like to do is sort of again, an intermediate path. Yes, there is some new concepts to be brought in, but there's also a way to look at it methodologically that can be shifted, right? So for me, what I'm trying to do is try to move away from this kind of traditional induction or deduction inference structure. Because if you have this linear argument, especially if you're a systematic philosopher, and I consider myself a systematic philosopher, what happens is with the weakest link, your argument stands and falls, right? You have this beautiful construction, let's say the Kantian system, and then you have this schematism, right? With the schematism, everything stands and falls, or the thing in itself. You can choose which one you want, right? But that's because I have one line that holds the entire system, one line of argument. Everything needs to align with that line of argument. What does that do? Well, psychologically, as a philosopher, that pushes me towards trying to make my arguments as strong as possible, to disregard data that kind of pushes against my reasoning, to disregard elements that might subvert what I'm trying to do, right? So just from a purely psychological perspective, that's not really helpful if you want to engage with something that's highly complex and highly subtle. What I'm trying to do, and I'm kind of stealing that from Peirce, is I'm trying to weave lines of argument together to create a tapestry, right? And the tapestry is supposed to show something through these lines of argument. The tapestry as a whole does not rely on any one of those lines of argument. So if you take my Husserl out and say, well, that doesn't work, I can weave another line in, right? So if we take singular elements out, that doesn't defeat the tapestry as a whole. And if I have a gap in the tapestry, that is not a problem. It either can be fixed by another line of argument, or to have a gap is also valuable information, right? If there's a part that I just can't come to terms with within that conceptual scheme, within that metaphysics, then I need to overhaul the metaphysics, right? So that's helpful. So I hope that this approach allows us to be less rigorous in a way and more curious. So it's less about creating the perfect argument, and it's more about being open to seeing what's there. And I'm trying to enact that, for example, in my Husserl chapter, where I discuss realist readings and idealist readings, and I say, well, either is possible, either is there in Husserl. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of Husserl's things and I'm going to use it to create a realist reading. But I don't need to say that that's what Husserl actually said, because my tapestry doesn't rely on any of the elements, right? And when you read the book, there's a lot of material that comes in, a lot of thinkers, a lot of thoughts, And what I'm trying to do is weaving together thoughts that all kind of like point towards the same direction, that kind of form a strand of thinking, more than a line of thinking, right? And then what you mentioned is the correlation between epistemology and ontology. And I believe
often, Wittgenstein uses the analogy of a rope made up of many, many strands that are overlapping.
Yeah,
so it's a similar kind of image.
Exactly. And I think if you come from either phenomenology or process thought, it immediately appears as much more adequate, because the phenomena are so complex and so varied and so multiple. To even believe that we could find an ultimate argument is a bit like it's hubris, right? There's just too much complexity, too much change, too much becoming. Yeah. So I think in Western philosophy, we have always brought together epistemology and ontology. We're just not explicit about it, right? So if you look at Plato says, I experience the world as changing. So that can't be the real world, because there would be no true knowledge. So the reason why the world of change has to be a copy is an epistemic one. So I have to have a world of true ideas, of true forms, in order to be able to have knowledge. So from the beginning of Western philosophy, the idea that thinking and being go together is always been implicitly there, but not explicitly acknowledged. And I think the only thing I'm doing is I'm just making it explicit, right? Any decision.
But there does seem to be a difference there, because what you're just claimed was that for Plato, he starts with epistemology and then infers metaphysics from that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a linear progression, whereas you emphasize very strongly that we have to deal with them together.
Yeah. So what the claim right now was just there has always been a mutual inference. And now I'm saying, if there is such a mutual influence right from the start, why don't we try for a change to deal with them together? Because we tried to separate them for 2,500 years, didn't work too well. Let's see what happens if we bring them together. Yeah, that would be the argument. So the idea is that there is a correlation between the type of epistemology or epistemological approach you choose and the kind of ontology you can unconceal, right? So if you think that reality is just pure matter, then any language analysis seems to be the wrong method to understand this reality. That seems obvious. If it's purely material, language analysis cannot get you there. So whatever ontology you presuppose or you imply kind of predetermines or selects or guides you towards a certain epistemology. And the other way is, and it works both ways, right? If you have an empiricist stance, you will hold that reality is independent from us knowing it. But then the question is, how do you know that that's its ontological shape, right? So whichever ontological stance, whichever epistemological stance you take, you kind of like predispose the types of objects you can pick out, or the types of methodologies that can help you pick out the objects that you presuppose are real. So while I'm not saying there's a one-to-one exact identity, like one epistemology will definitely pick out one ontology, there's a certain region of ontologies that become possible and that become impossible. So now what I'm doing is I'm saying the first thing we need to do is we need to define exactly what we're looking at. And I'm looking at the axis of concrete, particular, material, physical reality and logical truth, right? Thinking and being. You could open up that axis as subject-object. You could open up that axis as material realism, right? So you could open up that in various ways, and whichever opposition you open up will determine which approach, which epistemology will help you investigate this kind of continuum. So I say my continuum, and that's the only continuum I look at, is between concrete, singular, physical entities that we encounter in experience. So not pure matter, the things that we can encounter in experience, and mathematical or logical truth. And I claim that this is a continuum, right? On this axis, the pure material and the pure ego that's completely worldless, they are like regulative ideals that hold open that axis. And everything that actually exists is somewhere on that spectrum, right? And I can use phenomenology anywhere on that spectrum. But what I'm trying to do is that in that book is to push it as far as I can towards the concrete phenomena, right? So this is my setup. That's the only thing I'm looking at. So that's why I'm not using other methodologies like dialectics or language analysis, because the object I'm looking at is the one on this axis, on this end, so to speak. Yeah.
So you're looking away from the ego, from the self?
Yes.
And that's what makes it realism, would you say?
Yes. And what I'm not claiming is that there is ever going to be a full 100% realism or full 100% ego idealism, right? So those are regulative ideals that we can never fully reach as human beings, because there will always be our consciousness. What I'm trying to do is to push as far as I can to see how far we can get. And my claim in the book is that process ontology is the furthest that we can get to describing the concrete reality we live in.
And the necessary interconnection on this continuum of self and reality is also another kind of mutually interdependent pairing that mirrors epistemology and ontology. Is that correct?
That's why that's how it goes together. Yeah, exactly.
And this book was about the world side. Is your next one going to be about the mind side?
It's gonna be about truth.
Truth. All right.
So that will be all the Heidegger that's missing. The lacuna of this book is Heidegger, because it's everywhere in the background but never in the foreground. That'll be the next book. It'll be all Heidegger.
Well, it's about time. That's yeah. And I mean, this again, it can be seen as a pretty radical alteration to the way that we think about reason, the way that we're taught to reason. Did you find it at all uncomfortable to change, or was it like coming home and breathing for the first time when you started thinking this way?
I believe that in reading Whitehead and reading Heidegger kind of trains you in this mode of thinking already. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is what we'll discuss a little later in the analytic continental split. I'd rather have both options, right? So I'd rather not have to choose between one reason and the other, because there are elements in the book where I hope I managed to have very linear and clear reason. Like when I discuss Rousseau, for example, so I get super technical. Because I believe that within any investigation, there might be elements that should be looked at by precise analysis and looked at whether the concepts are logically consistent and coherent. But there are other elements of an investigation which might not be amenable to the treatment, right? This is the concept of adequacy that I try to introduce. There is not one size fits all. It really depends on what you're doing, and every investigation is context relative. Every investigation is situated within a certain question, with a certain context, with a certain aim, somewhere I want to go. Am I still here? Have you lost me? Oh no, okay, you're back.
No, it's all good, I think, Tina.
Okay, so Lee froze on my screen, so.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, so where was I? Yeah, analytic continental, right? So I don't want to have to choose. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Basically, I'm greedy.
Have you found this other way of thinking and looking at, and as well as conceiving of the world, bleeding out into your kind of daily activities beyond sitting at the desk and reading?
Yes, absolutely. It's just a way of seeing the world that I think is necessary for the world we live in. We live in such an interconnected, high-speed world where thinking in stable, static entities that are not connected is actually counterproductive. any systemic change that we want to affect, any understanding of the impact of social media, the internet, the information age on everything is not, it's not easy to grasp that within linear reason. It's not easy to structure it that way. But to try to approach it as a whole in its complexity and to look at it from various sides and integrating those sides as best you can within a tapestry allows us to see all the impacts in inputs and outputs, how it all comes together. And I think a lot of systems theory does precisely that. So there is a push within, I don't know, even within business, but also within ecological movements, within science, especially biology, to think in systems. And systems thinking is very close to process thought. So it brings on all the relationality. What's missing is the temporality. So it's the temporal dimension. So when people talk to me about systems thinking, I usually say, so have your system, have the complexity, have all the nodes and the relations, and then press play. And that's the world, right? And I think that's a very good way to think about it. And that's what I'm trying to do, press play.
That's often seen as one of the main differences between what's very loosely grouped as the post-structuralist versus the structuralist, is that they introduce discontinuity in history and change. But what I'm hearing is that this is a trilogy, that the third one's going to be about politics.
Yes, it is. It's already planned. But let me write the second one first.
But also, it again, it seems like this view of not just this kind of holistic thinking, but this polyrational notion is, you could say, the only epistemology you could have for a truly dynamic reality. Is that because if it's changing, then we need to change how we think of it along with it. Would you agree with that? And
it's always about and that's where Heidegger's concept of releasement is in the background here. We always confronted with different phenomena and they change. And if we don't release our thinking to responding to whatever the phenomena show us, but we're trying to implement the same methodology rigorously, irrespective of the fluctuations and difference in the phenomena, we don't meet the world head on. We meet our idealization, our abstraction, what we would like it to be like, but we're not actually engaging with what is. And I think that's a lot of the problems we're having, especially when it comes to the digital world, is that if you look at laws, if you look at policies, if you look at NGOs that try to engage with the difficulties that we're encountering, it's always trying to find the same types of solutions that we found 500 years ago to problems. What I'm saying is this is a radically new problem that needs a radically new approach.
Mm-hmm.
But that's book 3, so.
Okay, so we're at 45 minutes, but we started 10 minutes late, so I'm going to press on a little bit more if that's all right.
That's absolutely fine. I thought we'd go till 4:55, so yeah, about another 10 minutes or so.
Okay. So one point that I had when I was reading it kind of had to do with this simultaneity, because I kept reading it and feeling like it isn't quite equal. That in fact, the metaphysics is more foundational than the epistemology, because the central obstacle to being able to really understand and view the world as dynamic, it seems to me, is some kind of substance ontology, right? I mean, substance ontology was come up with basically by Aristotle to explain change, and he explains change in terms of an unchanging thing. You know, he's trying to beat off, defend himself against Parmenides, who said change is inconceivable and therefore can't be. But in a way, he grants Parmenides the basic idea. You're right, something can't change. We have changing accidental features. But the problem is then all features are going to be accidental. And in particular for your project, relationships are going to be accidental. Temporality is going to be accidental. Things are what they are, and then they enter into relationships. Things are what they are, and then you press play. And this is something I'm working on with Heidegger right now, because he says, as long as you're talking about things that are temporal, they're not really temporal. As long as you're talking about things that are in relations, they're not deeply, truly related. And so it's this whole conception, and of course it's reinforced by grammar, subject, adjective kind of grammar, subject, verb grammar. And so we need to change our way of thinking and change our way of talking. Now, you talk at the end of the book about what you call a metaphysical consequence, that we need to get rid of substance. We need basically relations without relata, without things that are being related. But I felt, as I kept reading through it, is that that's the premise to this this attitude, the thing that you're looking for, and then epistemology kind of comes in its wake. So again, certainly they're connected, but they are ordered as I see it. And along with it, and this is I'll end right here, is that we get as sort of a bonus the unity of thinking and being along with it, because again, neither have substantial independent reality. So, it seems like that just solves all the issues, whereas substance prevents all of them.
Listening to you, the way you described that, it was just so interesting to hear that how often you used thinking terms, like how we can conceptual being, how we can understand substance, how we can access. So an ontology without access to it is useless, right? If I don't unconceal it, if I don't have access to it, if I don't understand it, it's not existent. So I can't say it's more fundamental. I need both. I need both a way to see that ontology and that ontology. And again, I wouldn't, just to clarify that, I wouldn't say that we should get rid of substance ontology. I think substance ontology is an excellent way of ordering and structuring the world in certain contexts, right? So if I want to categorize apples into different species, because I want to sell them for more or less money, having a simple category that's stable and static for the apple that's worth, I don't know, 50 pence and the apple that's worth 30 pence, it's very, very helpful, right? As a tool, it's not in and of itself problematic. It becomes problematic if it is the only explanation for everything there is and the only approach to anything, right?
Now, do you mean that it's a useful fiction, or do you mean that it's true in those contexts?
Okay, so processes generate certain more or less stable structures. So it is true that the processes that make up me cohere in a way that like this thing doesn't cohere in the same way with me than my, I don't know, my heart and my blood and so on and so forth. So there's some further coherence that is just, that holds together the process that can form quasi-stable objects, right? And those we're trying to pick out with substance ontology. Are they the most basic level of explanation? No. Are they therefore untrue? Also no, right? They are sort of a meta-stability constituted by certain processes that for some reasons, and Whitehead goes in lots of detail of why that is, cohere in a manner that other processes don't, right? But this coherence is temporal. It will fall apart sooner or later, right? So it's not an absolute coherence, but it's a temporal coherence. And if we understand substances to just pick out those, it's not a problem. If we understand substances to pick out the most basic fundamental constitutive elements of reality, then it turns false because it's inadequate to the context, if that makes sense. Right?
Well, I don't want to beat this too hard, but I don't think that you could call a coherence of forces a substance. I think that a substance has a different connotation than that.
Well, it depends. If you ask Leibniz, for example.
Right. I think Leibniz.
Yeah, it depends on how you define substance. Yeah, substance. True. Granted. Yeah. But I would say substances can be useful, but they're just not very good when you want to describe the actual concrete reality we live in.
Okay. So here is my last question, which you alluded to briefly earlier, which is the analytic continental split, something that I think is very important, very very harmful to our profession. And you are picking figures, I would say almost as if you weren't aware there were a split. Are you intentionally trying to overcome it? Are you trying to ignore it?
Trying to ignore it.
Play any role in your thought or this book?
So I believe that the split has been conceived in the minds of philosophers at the end of the 19th century. And if you look at philosophy before that, before the Vienna Circle, before Frege, it was always both. If you look in Aristotle, if you look in Plato, if you look in Leibniz, there's always elements of analysis and precision and clarity, but there's also elements that go beyond that, more holistic, more qualitative, more applied. The main figures I engage with, Bergson, Whitehead, and Husserl, all three of them are by training logicians or mathematicians. All three of them methodologically should, by any stretch of the imagination, fit into the analytic camp. But what they're doing is they're looking at complexities and qualities and correlations that are just not amenable to the analytic method. So they kind of fall out of it just because the method can't grasp what you're trying to do. And here I really like Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein famously said, if all you have is a hammer, then every problem turns into a nail. Right? And I think that's what the analytic continental split has done to philosophy. We have a specialized such that within phenomenologists, everything turns into a phenomenon. For an analytic philosopher, everything turns into a problem of language analysis. For a hermeneutic thinker, everything turns into a problem of exegesis. What I would advocate for is having all these tools at our disposal, looking at the problem and looking at the context and seeing which method is able to allow me to respond to this context. Again, with the background of releasement, it's not me kind of like determining the method before I look at the concrete problem that I'm trying to engage with. I'm trying to use methods to reply to the problem. And maybe I apply one method and I see my results aren't quite interesting enough or creative enough. It don't give me anything. So I apply the next method. And I don't see any reason to have to choose. So yeah, I'm just ignoring it.
In one of Heidegger's very late works, he describes Descartes as saying to the world, how do I think of you so that I can be omniscient about you? What kind of conception would give me complete, total knowledge of you? Whereas it sounds like you want a conversational, collaborative relationship with reality.
Because it always changes. We can never have a full view of it because we're not going to know what happens. Reality is creative. There is things that emerge. There's things that happen that we can't imagine yet. How could we ever know it all?
So we need to be co-creative with it. I can't think of a better definition of philosophy than that. I will hand things over to Ashley. Thank you very much.
Thank you for doing this with me.
Oh, I'm very happy to.
Okay, thank you both. So we have already a couple of questions in the chat we can begin with. So from Frank Ruder here at Dundee, we have, in sociological system theory, Luhmann, everything is about the reduction of complexity. Could such a reduction thus also be necessary to attain a proper account of complexity, or is only a complex account of complexity adequate?
Yeah, the question is, what do I want? Do I want a definition of a complexity? Then I need to reduce. Do I want to describe the actual complexity on the ground so I can figure out maybe what policies can help shift the complexity in a certain direction? Then if I abstract, I will lose the complexity. So it depends on what I want, I would say. Does that answer your question, Frank?
There's actually a response to
good.
Frank, which maybe I can read, and then we can turn over to Frank. But it's from Leo, who says, "I'm not fully aware of Luhmann's meaning of reduction of complexity, but taking a pragmatic approach, it suggests that an account of complexity or of a complex system should be sufficiently complex to account for the properties that we focus on. Anything less would be relatively simplistic, and perhaps anything more would be unnecessarily difficult to work with."
So it's context relative, depends on what you want to do with the investigation and the results.
Exactly. It is context relative, but because it's context relative, it necessitates a decomplexification, right? I mean, so complexity can only be sustained if one has context, and context is a reduction, right? I mean, this is why the operations, let's say, of a system of law, or the coding of a system of law is very different from the coding of the system of economy or the coding of something else. And that seems to mean that the dual approach that you indicated needs also to apply to complexity, right? So any complex account of complexity malfunctions because it's just reproducing complexity and not giving an account of complexity, and hence has a representational problem, because then we just get chaos.
True, and that's why any linguistic philosophical approach will never be fully adequate. You're absolutely right. But what I'm trying to do, or my argument would be, that shouldn't preclude us from trying to push as far towards it as we can. So while I wouldn't claim that I ever achieve full representation of complexity, because that's impossible, as you say, I can try to be as faithful to the complexity as it's possible within the tools I have, within language, within the philosophical framework. Otherwise, maybe a hermitage might be the other option.
Thanks, Tina.
Yeah, no, but yeah, you're absolutely correct. That's why it's always a matter of degrees and not a matter of fully achieving any of those outcomes.
Okay, we have a few more questions. So I have to apologize in advance. I'm going to mispronounce your name probably, but we have a question from Professor Uguwani, who says, "It is often expected that available data from human experience should assist in processing thought. Does this approach to reality not affect or disfigure this assumption? And if it does, what is the effect on the progress of thought?"
The question is whether we can think of thought as linearly progressing towards an aim. As soon as you have this idea that reason or thought linearly grows towards more knowledge or more certainty, then my approach is inadequate, right? But that is a presupposition that I don't think is borne out by the data. If we look at the development of human reason, it looks like there is no clear linear progression. And if that's the case, then I don't think so. But I don't know, Lawrence, what do you think?
I think we've actually lost him.
Oh, okay.
He was recently here. He seems to have disappeared, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps he'll return, but let's move on to the next question. So Undina, yeah, do you want to turn on your microphone, Undina, and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. And sorry not to appear in person, Tina, but it's lovely to be here. So my question really comes out of the last part of the discussion where you were talking about continental and analytic traditions. And I loved that way of a kind of releasement or a responsiveness out of which different kind of methodological approaches might emerge, and also just the I guess just the kind of eclectic openness to not need to choose or to side alongside that kind of historical divide But I guess I have a question which is perhaps a kind of ethical or political one, to do with what it might be to host different methodologies, different potentially incompatible methodologies, because, you know, there's one way to think about, well, attentive to this dimension or this problem or this kind of part of the world, I take this method, and here with this problem, I take that one. But I guess my question would be, is there also then a kind of, I mean, does it matter to you, the question of how you might host different and incompatible and potentially discordant methods or approaches, and hold them at once? Or is it simply that you pick up one tool and put another aside?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Lots and lots of issues, but I think the first thing to say there is, and this is what the next book is about, it's the criterion of adequacy. So what I don't want is a methodological pluralism where I go like anything goes, you just try anything out, see what happens. It's more about very, very precisely defining your question, the aim that you want to achieve by asking a question, and the object that you're looking at. So very clear distinctions between those three elements. And then choosing a method you think adequate to do all those. So that can then, if somebody else shares the precise same object, the precise same interest in the precise same question, using the same method, it should result in the same results, right? So we're not in relativism here. So we have some criterion to compare. Now, which method to choose in a certain respect for a certain question and a certain object is a matter of debate. And I would just be like pragmatic. We'll have to try it out. What results does it give us? Because I don't believe that a method in and of itself should be judged as good or bad, but what results does it give us? If our aim in investigating X is, I don't know, understanding its social implications, and our method is such that social implications can never figure in, then our method's just inadequate. Nothing wrong with the method, it just doesn't work for our question. And that's a matter of discussion and also a matter of degree. So it will never be ultimately to say, okay, this method will never work for this type of question, because we need to see what exactly the situation is that we're dealing with. So we're buying the way of doing things that I'm building buys a whole lot of complexity, but it also allows for a whole lot of creativity and openness and discursiveness.
So I mean, I can see that you kind of don't want a relativism. Is there room then, and that you want the attentiveness and the responsiveness to the particular situation, the particular problematic. But what you also seem to be saying is that within that, then there is discussion, debate, and room for, is there room for within that one method, or is there room to be hospitable to host in a contested way, or in a way where the expectation isn't that things perfectly fit, a kind of small constellation of methods?
And so I think the idea of having competing methods is predicated on the idea that we have to have a stable ultimate final answer. And if the methods disagree, then or lead us to create some difference within the object, that's the problem of diverging methods. But if I say what I'm doing, looking at concrete, complex, changing dynamic reality, I say there will never be an ultimate account. So there will never be a way that all methods can agree, because nature itself is changing. So it's not a problem, because I don't have expectation of a singular outcome.
I see that.
In that context. if I'm a physicist and I want a precise outcome, and that in my question, my field of investigation is a possible outcome, then it turns into a problem. And then we need to figure out which method is the most adequate. So again, context relative, what your investigation is.
Yeah, thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Okay, so a question from Graham, who says, my ears pricked up at the mention of Peirce. Could you say a little more about how you see Peircean views interacting with process philosophy and phenomenology?
Sadly, no. I have a lot of stuff in that book, and I've explicitly decided to not do pragmatism. One reason is because there's quite a few people who actually work on the intersection of American pragmatism and process philosophy. So there's quite some material out there. I can send you some book links if you want, that they can help you out, but I'm sorry, I can't. I just stole his method. Sorry.
Okay, so Oliver Williamson says, amazing talk, exclamation mark. Question, why is your tapestry model of reasoning / argument not a mere set of linear arguments?
Because they're relational. They connect in different ways with different other arguments. So a linear argument always has a premise, a second premise, a conclusion. The conclusion then acts again as a premise. For me, one premise is the conclusion in the other argument and acts as the premise for something else. So it's complexly structured, if that makes sense. So each statement just doesn't have one function. It functions, it has different it has different roles for different sets of lines of argument. Does that help? It's more visual. I can draw it for you sometime.
Okay, makes sense to me. I'm not sure about Oliver. Okay, a question from Nick Bunnan. Have you thought about Heidegger's engagement with Taoism and Buddhism?
A lot. I think, so a further thing which I didn't get into, which will be book 3, is the fact that both Whitehead, process ontology, and I focus more on Heidegger's philosophy, have a lot of overlap with Buddhism and or Taoism, right? So those systems are similar and those ways of thinking are similar. So to think in complexity and concreteness and wholes. I personally am very interested in Buddhism. I've worked on Nagarjuna. I didn't do much Nishitani. I'm aware of him, but he is a very interesting figure working with Zen philosophy and Heidegger. Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot there. And I think it's not like this way of thinking is my idea. I'm just trying to bring what connects Heidegger's way of thinking and Whitehead's way of thinking and these Buddhist ways of thinking. They have something in common. They have something in common that is being lost in traditional Western academic philosophy. And that's what I'm interested in. That's how all these things hang together for me.
Could I have a follow-up?
Yes.
Absolutely. Support, yeah.
There are other figures you could think of. Heraclitus is part of our tradition, but often ignored or walled out as ridiculous or unimportant, particularly with regard to truth. And Heraclitus and his notion of flux is very, very close to mainstream Chinese thinking, where the foundational document is a commentary on the Book of Changes, where change is fundamental, but made metaphysical by this commentary that was ascribed to Confucius, but it has a longer, more complicated history. Another figure in the phenomenological and post-phenomenological tradition is Emmanuel Levinas, whose view is anti-ontological and anti-epistemological in the sense that his first philosophy is ethics and metaphysics, and the metaphysics is one of otherwise than being. And again, I would hope at some point to have a chance to talk to you about any of these things. I'm inspired by what you have said. And despite the immense expense, until the paperback comes out, I will rush to read your book.
The price is atrocious, I agree with you. Absolutely, I'm always happy to talk about philosophy. So just drop me an email, we can meet up. That's not a problem. Funny enough, my first book, it's sadly in German, so I don't know if that's of any help. About eine Ontologie des Konkreten, an ontology of the concrete. I tried to spell out the precise understanding of a dynamic concrete, and this book is more the metaphysics, so the framework for it. Mm-hmm. And in that first book, I start in ancient Greece. I do Thales on water, which is a processual dynamic metaphor. Anaximander, Anaximenes. I do a lot on Heraclitus. I treat Parmenides as a mystic, because what the poemium starts with is his soul being whisked up in heavens. The idea of reading Parmenides as a logician is a very modern one, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. And then I go into Aristotle, and I would even go so far as to claim that Aristotle, if you read his De Generatione Corruptione and his physics, he's a process thinker. It's only those texts where he focuses on language or on ontos, on being, that he becomes a substance thinker. So even in Aristotle, it really depends in which context he investigates what he investigates. Does he look at language? The more he looks at language, the more substantial his arguments become. Or does he look at physis, at unconcealment, at nature, at animals? The more processual his arguments become. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a lot in Western tradition, but I think Heidegger is somebody who saw that. Levinas is somebody who saw that. The late Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in his lectures on the nature, saw that, and he read Whitehead. So there's lots of like undercurrents going on. But as one of the stated aims of this book was also to kind of introduce phenomenology to the process thinkers and process thought to the phenomenologists. Yeah, there is limits. But yeah, I would love to talk anytime.
Yeah, I just want to add in, I think Heraclitus ranks with the greatest thinkers in the canon. I'm a huge fan. The other pre-Socratics don't do much for me, but Heraclitus is just amazing. I'm writing about and teaching Heraclitus and Heidegger on Heraclitus right now. And he's just, really a giant. Would you mind, Nick, typing in the names of those books you mentioned? Because I'd love to take a look at those in the chat. Or send an email?
I'll send an email. I have a broken hand, which is not very dexterous.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Please CC me into that one. Sure.
Okay, well, we have plenty of time for more questions and comments. So please write them into the chat, or if you would prefer to speak them, perhaps come on camera, you're most welcome to do that. Please just raise your hand and we'll get to you. Maybe while you're all thinking of more questions, I can ask one of my own, if that's okay. So Tina, I was impressed by your fearless embrace of the term correlation in your book. Given the context of speculative realism over the past 10 or 15 years, in which the term correlationism has been used as to designate everything that's bad about philosophy since Kant at least, and this assumption that we're always already caught in the correlation between the mind and the world, or perhaps the mind and being, perhaps thought and being, so we can never step outside of that and say anything about being which is not conditioned by our own thought. So I was just wondering, well, number one, how your use of the term correlation relates to this term correlationism, and if you think the correlation is anything to be afraid of.
No, never be afraid of correlations. So what I find really funny about that argument, and it's in his book on finitude, he talks about it. I can't do it by heart, but the quote is something like the co of correlation of co something or other and co something or other. But for all his mentioning of the that's part of correlation, he doesn't actually do anything with it. And if you go to the dictionary and you look up relation and you look up correlation, those are two different things, right? A correlatio means mutual interaction. It's not just any old relation, it's a relation where one thing acts, then the other responds in a correlated manner, right? And that goes both ways. It's not just that the mind moves and our image of the world changes. When the world changes, our image of the world, when the world changes, our image of the world changes in a correlated manner, right? So in my chapter on phenomenology, I'm trying to say, even if I stick with Husserl, if I stick with the epoche, if I stick with the layers of consciousness, if I stick with the whole framework, when I look at a changing object, so I don't move, I hold my consciousness still, I observe a changing object, and I do this in a lot of detail that I can't replicate here. But what happens is it's a breaking in of the change of the object into my consciousness. It's correlated, but it's not caused. And there's many reasons why I can do that I do in the book. I don't think, except if any Husserl fans are here, we can try to get into it. But the idea is that if you have a correlation, you have a further dimension, namely an interactiveness. And that's this interactiveness that allows me to use the term in a way that's a bit different from Méliès, because it's not a static relation that's just once and for all and we're stuck in it. It's responsive, it's released, so to speak. And the second thing that's different is within process ontology, and especially within Heidegger's phenomenology, relation means internally related. I kind of alluded to that, but I didn't draw it out. So as Lee said, in Aristotle, you have substances and then they're externally related. So you take the relation away and the substances stay the same. Within a processual view or a phenomenological view, there is nothing that's completely context independent, that's completely separate from the relations. So there's always a level of interaction. There's always a level of interaction that co-constitutes what is. So I cannot just look at the ego as something that is completely separated or unrelated, nor can I look at the world as completely separated and unrelated. So it's all co-constitutive and responsive. So all the world is correlated, and it also correlates with mind. And if you want to do some scientific examples, which is always problematic, but if you look at the double slit experiments or other quantum phenomena, it seems to be the case that our consciousness also does something with the world, right? And it's this dimension of correlation, right? The interactive dimension, the processual dimension, that makes it possible for me to get this argument off the ground. And I really don't understand how many assume. He treats it as if it was any old relation. It's not what it is.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot, Tina.
That was easy.
Well, I would add, I mean, one thing about this is that any hard-nosed realist would not acknowledge this as realism because of that.
Yeah.
You know?
Because I say I try to get as close to realism as I possibly can. But
Right,
yeah, it's
right.
not 100% true.
It's not hard-nosed realism.
Yeah.
But who cares about
Yeah,
that?
I can live with that.
Okay, so we have a couple of comments on the strands of thought, relations, and the weaving metaphor. And it's perhaps a good point on which to also communicate that I'm feeling a little confused by the complexity of the strands of thought in the questions as well. So we have
very fitting.
Yeah, so we have we have follow-ups from various points. So I'll just quickly maybe read Frank's point on the correlation. So Frank says, so there is one correlation that is transcendental, which means that there are two stable poles that are related through one creative form of relation? Question mark.
No, I would say the correlation itself is multidimensional. So I am looking at one strand, the one between concrete phenomena and logical truths, but you could open up other strands that are correlated. But it's always a correlation between an epistemological and an ontological stance.
And Leo says correlation as the Buddhist notion of dependent co-arising? Question mark.
Yeah, works.
Okay, so 2 comments on the issue of the tapestry and linear arguments. So Oliver Williamson follows up by saying, couldn't each relation between the linear arguments be extracted out and presented as another linear argument, so that the tapestry could eventually be reduced to a set of linear arguments? Question mark. And then Heather has a reply to that, so I'll just read that and then perhaps you can respond, Tina. So Heather says, rather like, or the opposite of, indeed, Penelope's disappearing tapestry in the Odyssey, as time act or time art or essential reduction, it is interesting to have a metaphor almost act as explication of method.
Yeah.
Any response, Tina?
Yeah. So Ollie, you could, but what you would do is you would change the tapestry into something else. Transforming arguments into a linear logical structure is a translation. So whenever you translate, you do something to the object of translation. So you transform it. You can do it, but you won't have the same thing. So it won't be identical. To Heather. So the story is that Penelope keeps herself safe by making the tapestry disappear. I don't really understand how that's connected. I really like to think in metaphors, because I feel that if I can see and touch in my mind what I'm thinking, it becomes more real. But I don't know what to say about that. It's time act or time art or central reduction. Can you say more about that, Heather? Would that be possible? Oh, okay, sorry. Maybe we can talk about it later.
Okay, we do have a question from Graham. I'll just switch on screen.
Hi, Tina.
Hi.
Yeah, so I'm having heard that the book's really expensive, I'm just going to get you to answer my questions now. So one of the things that I, in the debates that I'm in, which I appreciate a sort of slightly different group of people than the ones that you're mainly speaking to, but the kind of question of why we should believe that the world is dynamic is a big one. And there's this thought, look, so there's increasingly widespread acceptance that from your perspective, the world is dynamic. But as it were, we can debunk all that by explaining, well, that's what you would expect for a creature that's evolved with your kind of situation. But then when we look at science or something, all the dynamism isn't needed anymore. So, and I take it the big argument for reintroducing dynamism sort of comes from processes within science and the fact that, but I was wondering if you could sort of say how you think about kind of that debate, or I know it's the continental word, that problematic.
Yeah, so as far as I know, from the Big Bang to our constantly expanding universe, nothing in this physical world is eternal. Every atom, every particle, every force has come into being with the Big Bang. We're now undergoing either a big crunch or a big crush. We don't quite know what it is, but it seems to be fairly clear that we're not, that the universe isn't static. So
that's a move that they're not going to go for, right? Because they're going to say, look, the question about whether it's static or not, it's really a question about whether we think that change is disanalogous with variation across space, or whether change is just temporal variation. And so sure, there's lots of temporal variation. Why should we conclude that there's something that disanalogous apart from our perspective?
I'm not quite sure I get the question, but maybe what could clarify is two things. For me, temporality is change and change is temporality. I'm aware of the thought experiments that kind of seem to prove that there can be passage of time without change. Yeah, we understand.
That's yeah. So that's a red herring. So
Yeah.
it's literally, so we do a timeline,
Yeah.
and we say this thing happens here, that thing's happened there. We have a flower bed with purple flowers at one end, yellow flowers the other. Go, look, the flower bed changes. It's
Yeah.
purple there, is
Yeah.
yellow here.
Yeah.
And change in time is just that, but it's, you know,
Yeah.
green in spring, brown
So
in autumn.
you're talking about like kind of eternalism, right? Everything's already there and it just appears to pass for us. So I'm a phenomenologist, so I believe that the phenomena tell us something about the world as it, right? There is no world behind it. And secondly, I would say that if you trust science, the data doesn't really support that interpretation. I would say it's a conceptual abstraction that can be very helpful in thinking about time, but it doesn't actually grasp temporality as a phenomenon. So I would distinguish between time and temporality, right? Temporality is what happens when beings unfold. So for me, temporality is the ontological change. So temporality is nothing in addition to or apart from becoming beings. Process, me wiggling my hand, right, creates temporality. Every single process unfolds and in its unfolding creates its own strand of temporality. What we intelligent human beings then did is we tried to find the most regular movement that provides us with an interval that we can measure. And then we took that as a standard, right? And now we have time. We have a standard against which every other process, every other unfolding is measured. So in reality, we have innumerable unfoldings of temporality, and we've transformed it into measurable time. And then we reflect on measurable time, and then we say, okay, measurable time looks linear. So we extend those timelines out into the infinite past and infinite future. And then we buy ourselves all sorts of logical problems that we then can try to solve. So my argument would be that Bergson there tries to show the fly the way out of the glass, right? We've created the problem by linearizing time. But temporality, the phenomenon of temporality, what we actually experience is not the same thing as the time we reflect on. That would be my answer.
Thank you.
Bergson to the rescue, exactly.
I mean, yeah, though, I mean, the philosophers of science that I speak to look at the debates that Bergson had with Einstein and think that that's a reductio on Bergson.
Fair point, fair point. Have you read, there is this book, I thought I had it right to hand, but I can't find it right now.
Let's assume I haven't read it.
Okay, it's by a philosopher and a scientist about the necessity of time for physics. So the idea that we can do physics without time is actually not adequate. I'll share the reference with you. And you'll have a big tome of answers. Lee Smolin is one of the authors. Do you know?
Oh, yes, he's a big Peirce fan, I recall.
Oh, well, there you go. Thank you.
Okay, there's a comment from J. Edward Hackett who says, more comment than question. You can be a hard-nosed realist because this person accepts mind-independent objects. But what about a realism that suggests that relations are the only thing that are mind-independently real, with all terms and relata as mediated through relations when we understand them? So I would call this a non-reductive process realism, and that's the ontological position I describe in my upcoming book on James.
Yeah, I would agree with you. That's why I call it dynamic realism. But if you have a hard-nosed materialist or a reductive eliminativist, they will not agree with you that relations are real. So yeah, but yeah, we're on the same page. Sorry, that was quick.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so Edward replies, obviously my excitement to review your book.
I like the excitement part.
Okay, we seem to have exhausted the questions in the chat, but would anyone else like to ask a question, perhaps come on camera or just turn on your microphone and ask something?
Now, could I ask something?
Please.
Nick, you talk about relations being important, but of course, the move from British idealism to analytic philosophy was centered for Moore and Russell on the denial of internal relations and the rejection of Bradley's logical thought. In very recent times, this has been reassessed, and the idea that Russell cleared the floor of old-fashioned Bradleyism is just a self-serving victor's myth, and that there's a lot that's dependent on Bradley and this kind of philosophy that was continuous with Russell, Moore, and later analytic philosophers. So that can be reassessed by trying to think about what notion of relation are we talking about? Is there the notion that you're leaning toward of reconciling materialism and idealism, one that is reviving a holism where there are at least some internal relations to give context to anything which seems to be just on its own?
I think that's about right. So I worked a little bit, not too much, on the debates around Bradley, and the difficulty with internal relations is that if you make them too strong, then you have the night where all sheep are black or all cows are black, right? Everything coalesces into into unity when differentiation becomes possible. So the idea is to balance out internal relatedness with this creative unfolding of process. So you have process that pushes towards diversification, towards creativity, towards outwards. That's the image that Bergson makes very strong. It's this explosion of élan vital. And on the other hand, you have this relationality that holds the system together. So it's like two competing elements that allows for the system to be internally related, but also complex and open. And I think that is the big difference to traditional holisms. Furthermore, within a process perspective, the holism is never closed, right? It's always open towards the future. You can view the present as an interrelated whole. You can view the past influences into the present, but you cannot have reality as such as a whole because it's always open towards the future. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a question from Ian in the chat. I have a simple question, which if I wanted to make it seem fancier, I would say it's always a good idea, Ian. Make your question fancier. If I wanted to make it seem fancier, I would say it's about the sociology of the analytic continental divide. What kind of response from people within mainstream analytic philosophy? What's the term lem? Have you gotten to this work? So what kind of response from people within mainstream analytic philosophy have you gotten from this kind of work?
None. Very simple. But I do think that is changing. I do think at the very least, Husserl is becoming a persona grata within the analytic camp now. So as soon as you start with Husserl and start taking him, and Husserl, I am sorry, if you read him, if that's not analytic philosophy, I don't know what is. He's never made a distinction he didn't like. So what you buy into, so I've written about this, but when you do phenomenology, what you do is you say the quality of how a phenomenon is given matters. So it's not just the logical structure, it's not just the meaning, it's not just the the true or the false. It is the how, the quality of how it's given. So your mental content, its quality becomes relevant. And that is something that makes it impossible. It cannot be reduced to with the same tools as meaning or truth or logical facts can, right? So I think within the analytic camp, there is a shift going on, but yeah. And I don't, what I also want to mention is that I believe there's lots of continental philosophers, especially in the continent, maybe less so in the UK and maybe less in Australia, that could benefit from some introduction to logic. So I think it goes both ways. And it just depends that the environment you grew up in, whether one is the dominant or the other. I can just say on the continent, if you weren't a Hegelian or Heideggerian 20, 30 years ago, you just had no chance. And that's shifting, right? And I think in the UK, we see the opposite shift, slowly. Well, I'm an old optimist.
I'm tempted as a lemming just to weigh in here.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I met you at conferences with other analytic philosophers in which, you know, you were talking, I mean, so someone like Emily Thomas, I think, was hosting one of the, you know, she's a really good example of someone who is, you know, Cambridge trained analytic philosopher, with worked with Hugh Mellor, you know, kind of very, very traditional thing, but is really embracing embracing a lot of these things. And I think there's a few of us in philosophy of time that are also with non-Western philosophy, but are increasingly sort of thinking, right, are we stuck in the constraints of our own tradition? And I'm very pleased that you invited me to your conference last September to keep that dialogue going. So I think that there is at least some response, hopefully both ways.
Yeah, no, so yeah, I was more thinking about the book, but you're absolutely right. And what I also want to say, there is continental philosophers like Ben Zahavi that starts to work with science. So there is merging going on, and I'm all for it. I think we can only all be better for it. But yeah, thank you, Remy, for that.
So there's another question from Oliver Williamson, who says, given the dislike of the subject-object dichotomy and the like, why use another one-dimensional model with renamed poles? Concrete, singular physical entities of experience versus mathematical logical truth. Why not try to move away from binaries, or were you just simplifying?
I think it's within Indo-Germanic language, I think it's almost impossible to not open up binaries if you want to talk about anything, or maybe we're just so used to it. What I was wanting to do with that binary is though open up a continuum, precisely trying to say that the binary ends aren't actually real. What's real is the continuum between them. So I was trying to actually undermine this idea of binary, but it's very difficult to do, and our minds kind of snap back to that because we're so trained to think in either or opposites. But yeah, the attempt was to open up a continuum instead of having either this and that. And the idea was to be on that continuum and to push towards one pole that doesn't render the pole more fundamental or opposite. And it tries to be, what I do with that, when I do that, I sort of take the binary and put it into every element of the continuum, right? In a way. So it's still not adequate, granted, but I don't know any better way of doing it so far. If you have any ideas, let me know.
Just a quick comment, I think, from Leo, who says complementarity as a dynamic continuum of contrasting poles.
Nice. I like it. I'll steal it.
And Oliver says very interesting, thanks. Okay, any further questions or comments? I think, Tina, you're probably getting a little tired. You've been working very hard. Yeah,
I really enjoy speaking about philosophy, but like an hour, 40 minutes is it for me.
Yeah, maybe we should bring this to a close then. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone, for attending, and congratulations once again to Tina on your new book.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here and discussing my book with me. Have a grand evening, everyone. Thank you.
And
thank
just a
you,
quick,
Lee, for doing this.
and just, yeah, thank you very much, everyone. And just a quick reminder, we have one more event, visiting speaker event for the Scottish Centre for Continental Philosophy next Wednesday. So please look out for that. Thank you.
Bye.
And goodbye.